You're lying on a wooden ship. You can smell the pine tar. Beneath your back, rough planks creak. Above you, a pale sky stretches over a frozen fjord. Suddenly, fire, not warmth, but flames, rising, crackling. And you? You're not quite dead. Welcome to the Viking funeral. What really happened at these legendary send-offs? Would you be laid to rest in honor or terror? And what secrets smoldered beneath the flames? Let's find out. For a Viking, death wasn't an end. It was the beginning of the final, most important journey. Imagine it. You've lived a hard life. You fought with an axe and shield, carved your name into sagas, or maybe you herded sheep, raised a family, and whispered to the gods on cold, windy nights. Either way, when death came, by sword or sickness, it wasn't seen as a defeat. It was a crossing. In Norse belief, how you died mattered almost as much as how you lived. Fall in battle, that was your golden ticket to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where slain warriors fought by day and feasted by night. But if death came to you in bed, from age or illness, then you were headed to hell, a shadowy underworld beneath the roots of the world tree. No fire, no glory, just cold mist and silence. And this belief shaped everything that followed. The funeral wasn't about grief alone, it was about equipping your soul, helping you cross into the realm that matched your deeds. That's why some bodies were buried with weapons, jewelry, or tools. Others with food, animals, even boats. Not for luxury, but for survival in the next world. But it wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes the dead didn't go alone. Because for the living, honoring the dead was also a way of honoring themselves, showing the gods, the tribe, the world, that this person mattered. And that meant rituals, rites, and sometimes sacrifices. So before we even reach the fire or the sea, we have to understand this. A Viking funeral was never just about saying goodbye. It was a test, a rite of passage. And for those left behind, it was a message. This was a life worth remembering. Not every Viking funeral was lit by flame or launched into the sea. In truth, Viking funerals were as varied as the lives they marked. Two major customs defined them: burial and cremation. And which one did you receive? That depended entirely on who you were. If you were poor, just a fisherman, a servant, a child, you might be buried quietly in the earth, your body wrapped in cloth, laid in a shallow pit. A few small items might accompany you: a brooch, a comb, maybe a blade. Nothing fancy, just enough to get by in the afterlife if the gods were kind. But if you were powerful, a chieftain, a warrior, someone whose name carried weight, then your send-off became something else entirely. Cremation was considered more than a disposal method. It was purification. The fire didn't just burn flesh, it released your spirit. The smoke rose skyward, believed to carry your soul to the gods. Flames weren't destructive, they were sacred. And the vessels of that fire, sometimes they were real ships, dragged ashore or set afloat. Other times they were symbolic, boat-shaped stone mounds or wooden frames built like hulls. Either way, the shape mattered. It told the story of a journey, a soul setting sail across the great unknown. But these weren't quiet events. They were public, loud, performative, designed to impress the tribe, the gods, and perhaps even the dead themselves. Some funerals combined both rites, the body burned and the bones buried afterward in elaborate mounds, sometimes with swords, shields, and silver stacked like offerings. Burial anchored you to the land. Cremation sent you to the sky, and in Viking belief, both paths had power, so long as they were done with honor. That honor? It was everything. Let's say you were a Viking chieftain, a man who had ruled in life and was expected to rule in death. Your funeral wasn't going to be quiet. It wasn't just a way to say goodbye. It was a show, a declaration, a myth being written in real time. And at the center of that myth, the ship. The image is powerful. A vessel pulled ashore, its hull packed with your weapons, your finest clothes, your mead horn, your favorite horse, maybe even your hunting dogs. It wasn't just burial, it was storytelling. The kind that would be whispered around fires long after your bones turned to ash. But here's where things twist. According to Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat who witnessed a Viking funeral firsthand, these send-offs weren't just about treasure and tribute. they were also about blood. He described one such funeral in brutal detail. A chieftain had died. His people mourned, but not with tears. They prepared. For 9 days they drank, chanted, sang. And then one of the chieftain's slave girls stepped forward. She volunteered to join him in death. But was it truly a choice? Fadlan wrote how she was paraded through the camp, embraced and kissed by the men, then led to the ship, where a ritual priestess, known as the Vulva, stabbed her in the chest. Her body was laid beside her master. The ship was set ablaze. Together they burned. Together they were sent to the afterlife. We don't know how often this happened. Was Fadlan describing a rare ritual or a common tradition? Viking sagas are strangely silent. But the fact that even one funeral like this took place tells us something chilling. To die a Viking death, others might have to die with you. Death wasn't a surprise in the Viking world. It was expected, especially if you lived by the sword. But when it finally came, your people didn't rush to bury you. First, they had to prepare you for the afterlife. The preparations began immediately. The body was washed, carefully, deliberately. Warm water and cloth, usually handled by women of the household or a ritual elder. This wasn't just hygiene, it was symbolic, washing away the dirt of life, cleansing the soul, readying it for the long voyage beyond the mortal realm. Next came the dressing, not in rags, in honor. The dead were clothed in their finest garments. Warriors were dressed in mail or leather armor with weapons at their sides. Women were adorned with brooches, beads, and embroidered cloaks. Every detail mattered, because these weren't just clothes, they were tools for the journey to the next world. But it didn't stop there. The grave goods had to be selected. This wasn't casual, it was ceremonial. Swords, axes, shields, food, drink, and livestock, jewelry and silver coins. For chieftains, horses, wagons, sometimes even ships. For the wealthiest, it could mean entire crews or enslaved people. And of course, there was the mead. Funerals weren't sober affairs. The mead flowed like rivers. Guests drank to the dead, sang their praises, recalled heroic deeds, real or imagined. Storytelling wasn't a sideshow, it was central. By remembering the deceased's feats, you were securing their legacy. You were keeping them alive, in memory if not in body. But underneath the songs and toasts, there was something darker. Because this wasn't just a celebration, it was a sacrifice. Everything placed with the body was something the living had to give up. Gold, animals, people. To honor the dead, the living had to bleed. You've been washed, dressed, honored. The stories have been told, the mead has been spilled, and the gods have been called upon. Now comes the moment that separates legend from ash, the building of the pyre. Forget the romantic image of a lone ship sailing off into the sunset, flames licking its sails. That may have happened sometimes, but most Viking funerals were firmly rooted on land. Earth and fire, not wind and waves. The pyre wasn't haphazard, it was engineered, stacked high with seasoned wood, dried kindling, and sometimes layers of turf or seaweed to control the burn. Everything had a purpose. The flame had to be hot, fast, and thorough. The soul needed to be released, not trapped in smoldering flesh. The ship, or the coffin, or the symbolic boat, was placed atop this wooden mountain. And then, the body. But the Viking wasn't going alone. All around them, tokens of life were carefully arranged. Their sword lay beside them, cleaned and oiled. Their drinking horn refilled one last time. Bowls of food, jugs of ale, piles of clothes, tools, animal skins. Horses, dogs, sometimes even livestock were tethered to the edges, eyes wide with fear. In rare, grim cases, humans. Every object added wasn't just a gift, it was fuel. Not for the fire, but for the journey. The Vikings believed the dead needed these things in the next world just as much as they had in this one. And every item burned sent a message. This person mattered. Then came silence. The crowd would fall quiet as the final pieces were set. One last look, one last breath, because once the fire was lit, there was no turning back. What was once flesh would become flame, and what was once a man would become a myth. Who ran the show? Often it was a ritual priestess. Now picture her, cloaked in animal skins, her face painted with symbols no one dares to question. She stands barefoot on frozen ground, hair matted, staff in hand, carved with runes that whisper to the dead. This is the Vulva, the seeress, the priestess, the woman who walks between worlds. In Viking society, she was feared, revered, and never ignored. While men ruled with axes, she ruled with secrets. And when it came time for a funeral, she didn't mourn. She commanded. If you were an honored warrior or a powerful chieftain, she would preside over your final rites. But this wasn't some gentle goodbye. It was a ritual, a negotiation with the gods, and the Vulva was the mediator. We know about her role from Ahmad ibn Fadlan's 10th century account of a Viking funeral on the banks of the Volga River. He describes a woman who orchestrated death with terrifying precision. When a slave girl volunteered to follow her master into the afterlife, it was the Vulva who prepared her. Through days of ritual, chanting, intoxication, and ultimately execution. She wasn't just ending lives, she was shaping destinies. With every spell, she carved a path through the unknown. She offered the dead a chance to enter the next world cleansed, honored, and armed. But that came at a price. Blood, fire, obedience. Sometimes people feared the Vulva more than death itself. Because if she said your soul would wander lost, it would. If she said your legacy would rot, it did. So as she walked around the pyre, whispering to the gods and casting sacred herbs into the flames, everyone watched. No one dared interrupt. She wasn't weeping, she was weaving a story, and in her hands, even the fiercest warrior became just another chapter in the saga. Now the wind picks up, the flames crackle, sparks shoot into the air like arrows. You can hear the fire eating, meat, wood, cloth, bone. Everything turns to smoke, to ash, to vapor. The Vikings believed the fire didn't destroy the body, it transformed it into spirit, into story. Watching from a distance, villagers could see their leader's soul rising to the heavens, or descending if the gods willed it. The question is, where would yours go? Once the flames died, the ashes were collected, sometimes buried, sometimes placed in urns, sometimes scattered. Grave goods that survived the fire, like metal, were salvaged or buried in mounds, which still rise like silent sentinels across Scandinavian landscapes today. For weeks, people remembered the dead. Feasts were held, stories were shared, the living kept the dead alive through memory. But not everyone was remembered kindly. A coward in life, forgotten, a traitor, cursed. Only the brave earned song. So now let's come back to you. Would you survive a Viking funeral? Not likely, not because of the fire, but because of what it meant. Could you face death without fear? Could you bear the weight of legend? Could you live a life that demanded such a send-off? And even if you could, would you want one? Would you want to be burned with your possessions, your animals, or others? Would you trust those left behind to honor you, or to use your death for their own power? In the Viking world, funerals weren't gentle, they were tests, final judgments. And most of us, we'd fail. Today we romanticize Viking funerals. We see them in movies, majestic ships drifting into the mist, fire trailing behind like a comet. But the truth, they were raw, savage, unforgiving. They were not meant for comfort, they were meant for transformation. And for the Vikings, that's what mattered. You didn't just die, you crossed over, whether to glory, to hell, or to nothing. Your funeral was the final battle. And only the worthy made it through the fire,